thank you very much for inviting me here today to be part of your Hastings Reads program. This is a very appropriate book for you to be reading at this time because this year marks the 75th anniversary when President Franklin Roosevelt signed the executive order which removed Japanese Americans from the West Coast and placed us into American prison camps. So I think this is a very timely topic. If you are familiar with the book, the hotel mentioned in the title is the Panama Hotel, which is an actual hotel in Seattle, Washington. It's on 6th and Main. So if you travel there, you'll want to visit the hotel. In their tea room, they have many historic pictures of the hotel and the neighborhood that hotel is in. I was there about 5 years ago when this book first came out and visited the tea room with my sisters, and we actually had tea in that hotel. Now, there are so many things in that book that parallel my own life because our family grew up in Nihonmachi, Japantown, in Seattle. And I lived there until the age of 6 when the war made us move out of that area. Just to give you a little history of my family, my father came to America at the age of 18 in 1899. And he lived in Seattle for all those years before the war as a legal immigrant, because I don't know if you're aware that if you were Asian living in America, you were not even allowed to apply to become a naturalized citizen. That did not happen until 1952. So for all those years, he lived with his green card. When he was 34, he made a trip back to Japan and married my mother. This was one of those arranged marriages that families do. And so this is their wedding photo. My dad by then is 34 years old and my mom is 20. So you can see there's quite an age spread there. In Seattle, they raised a very large family. I am next to the youngest of 10. And the ages at the time of the war ranged from my youngest brother, who was 3, and my oldest sister, who was 21. Then comes Pearl Harbor, and all of a sudden, our lives are really changed and uprooted. Now, this was on a Sunday, and so our family was in church at the local Japanese Baptist church in Seattle. That is everyone except my brother Tom, who was 14 years old. He was, you know, that middle child, the one that always needs that extra attention. And so he was at the movies that Sunday. And he was watching the Humphrey Bogart movie called The Maltese Falcon. And he said, as the movie was playing, all of a sudden a scroll came across the screen saying, "All military personnel, report to your bases immediately." And he said people started looking around, wondering what's going on. And then when the movie ended, the manager came up front and said, "We've learned that Pearl Harbor has been bombed. Please go back to your homes quietly." And he said as soon as he got out into the lobby, people started pointing at him, saying, "Oh, there's a Jap, let's get him." And so he said he never ran so fast in all of his life to get home. He was sure he was going to get beat up. But fortunately, he made it home safely. But that was kind of the atmosphere at that time. Just because we looked like the enemy, everybody assumed we were the enemy. I think in my story, you're going to find many parallels to what is happening today to the Muslim American population. So it wasn't long before the FBI came to all of our homes and they took away what they considered contraband. Now, contraband to them were things like your camera, your binoculars, if you had a shortwave radio, if you had any firearms, or even those ceremonial Japanese swords. They took all those things away, confiscated them, and never returned them to us. Within 48 hours, 1,291 Issei. Issei are the Japanese immigrants. Isseis were rounded up by the FBI. They were who we considered leaders in our community. They were Buddhist and Shinto priests. If you were a teacher in a Japanese language school, if you were an instructor in a martial arts studio, if you were an editor of a Japanese language newspaper or a prominent businessman, these people were rounded up and taken off to prison, to one of the internment camps run by the Department of Justice in places like Missoula, Montana, Bismarck, North Dakota, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Crystal City, Texas. One of those rounded up was my father's cousin. Now, he had a law degree from the University of Washington, but because he was not allowed to become a citizen, he was not allowed to practice law. And therefore, he became a strawberry farmer. And why did the FBI pick him up? Because they found dynamite on his property. Now, if you've ever been in farming, I'm sure you know that it's not that unusual for farmers to have dynamite to clear their property. But they considered him suspicious. They took him off. His family for weeks had no idea where he was, even whether he was dead or alive, until finally they get a letter from Bismarck, North Dakota, where he's been detained, and that's where he spent his war years. We faced many, many acts of discrimination, not only before the war, but after Pearl Harbor. Because if you're familiar with American history, you know that there has been a lot of discriminatory acts against Asians. It started out with the Chinese, who were the first ones to come in any large numbers. They came here during the California Gold Rush. And as they became more successful, then there was this outcry about they're taking away our jobs. And finally, in 1882, they passed a Chinese Exclusion Act, which then prevented any more Chinese from immigrating to our country. And so then there was a labor shortage, and they looked to Japan for this new source of labor. And so the Japanese started coming. And the difference between the Chinese and the Japanese were that the Japanese came with their families, whereas the Chinese mainly came as single men. And so then the same thing starts to happen. As the Japanese become more successful, there's an outcry. And in 1924, Congress passes the Asian Exclusion Act. So Asians are no longer permitted to immigrate to the United States. So those are just some examples of this institutionalized racism that we faced. Because there was so much vandalism and hate crimes going on, people tried to save their property by putting up signs like this. Because of the Japanese living in the mainland United States, 2/3 of us were American citizens because we were born here. And so we should have had all of the civil rights that any American citizen has. At first, they asked us to just move ourselves away from the West Coast. But you know, that's easier said than done. Imagine my family of 10 children, most of us in school, my father in the restaurant business, and we didn't have any other contacts in other parts of the country. It wouldn't be so easy for us to just uproot ourselves and move to another state. And besides that, governors in the neighboring states sent out their state patrol and told them, if you see any Japanese families trying to move into our state, get them turned around and sent back. So on February 19th, 1942, 75 years ago, President Roosevelt signs an executive order 9066. And what this order does, it prescribes, well, first of all, it designates all of the West Coast a military zone. And the military is going to decide who can live there and who cannot live there. And then he puts the military in charge of that zone. And so you see in the executive order, if you can read it at all, there's not one word in here about excluding Japanese. But that is the intent of that law. Because as it turns out, the Japanese are the only ones moved from the West Coast. And the man put in charge is Lieutenant General DeWitt. And here is an exact quote from him. "The Japanese race is an enemy race. You needn't worry about the Italians at all, except in certain cases. Also the same for the Germans, except in individual cases. But we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he's wiped off the map. A Jap is a Jap, and that's all there is to it." So you can see what the attitude was during that time. When the Republican candidates were having their debates before this last election, Trump said almost the same thing. A Muslim is a Muslim. So then after the executive order is signed, all these signs are posted in our neighborhood knowing that we are living in a military zone and we're not sure what's going to happen to us, but they ask all of the Japanese families to go and register at what they called a civil control station. And each family was assigned a family number. So we became family number 11872. We were given these cardboard tags with string attached that we had to wear on our person, by putting it around a buttonhole or what have you. And then when it was time to move, we were to label each piece of luggage that we had with that same family number. Of course, we had to go through the usual shots, and anyone 14 years and older was fingerprinted. Now this is a picture of what the Nihonmachi neighborhood looked like before this executive order. It was a very thriving place with lots of businesses, and this is what it looked like after we were moved out of that area. This is a picture of the 5th grade class at Bailey Gatzert School. That's a school mentioned in this book, and that's a school that our family went to. I was in kindergarten. I had a sister in 3rd grade and another sister in 5th grade. This is a 5th grade class after the children of Japanese ancestry are moved out. So you can see that at least half, maybe a little more, of the students in that school were of Japanese ancestry. Because we knew that we were going to have to be moved, we tried to get what we could for our personal property. We had your household goods, people had cars, they had their house, and in some cases, people had only 1 week to take care of their personal affairs. These were the ones that lived on Bainbridge Island because there was a naval facility there, and they wanted to move them out as quickly as possible. But because everybody knew that you were going to move, and if you couldn't take what you had, you were going to have to leave it behind, nobody would give you anything fair in the way of a price for your things. And the worst case I heard of was this family that owned a floral nursery business in California, one of the largest in the state. They had owned it for over 25 years, had really built it up into a big business, and they were forced to sell it because who knew how long we were going to be away? And the most they could get for it was $1,500. Now, after the war was over, the same family went back to that nursery and saw the new owner, not the one that they sold it to, but someone different. And they said to him, "I'm just curious, how much did you have to pay for this?" And the man didn't want to say. And they said, "Well, the only reason we ask is because we used to own this place, and we had to sell it for $1,500. Well, the new owner just, his mouth fell open, and he said, "Oh my gosh, I paid $100,000 for this business." So you can see the kind of loss that people were taking. In today's economy, they said that the losses to our personal property and businesses would amount to $5.2 billion. Now, families then were given spaces, usually in church basements, or in the case of the book, in the basement of the Panama Hotel, to store things that they wanted to save. In our case, we stored some things at the Japanese Baptist Church. But in every incident, those places were ransacked, looted, vandalized, in some cases even set on fire, and so we had nothing left to go back to. It was late in March before our family then was told that they're ready to move us. They didn't move everybody out at once because in Seattle there were probably between 9,000 and 10,000 people of Japanese ancestry, and they had to find places to put us. The camps that they were going to eventually place us in weren't ready yet. They were in the process of being built. And so they were taking groups of about 500 at a time and moving them to the fairgrounds. This was in Puyallup, Washington, just south of Tacoma. So they moved us to the Puyallup State Fairgrounds, and the first thing that we had to do was make our own mattresses. They gave us these bags, and we had to fill it with straw, because all that we were allowed to bring was what we could carry. That meant just whatever would fit in a suitcase. So we were not allowed to bring any kind of furniture, let alone, you weren't, of course, allowed to even drive yourself in your car there. And they did tell us that we should bring our own bedding in the way of linens and towels and things like that. But we did have to then make our own mattresses, and they put people up in temporary buildings that they put up on the dirt parking lots. And besides that, they put up temporary buildings inside the oval of the grandstand, and they used the livestock buildings and the horse stables. And that's how they housed people. In our case, we were given one of the rooms in one of these temporary buildings in a parking lot. Now, I'm talking about a 20 by 20 room for 12 people. So you can imagine, it's just lined up bed upon bed. And besides that, there was no other furniture anyway. And of course, no running water, only one electric bulb for electricity. And we had to take all of our meals in a common mess hall and go to a common bathroom facility. In California, they used the Santa Anita racetracks and the Tanforan racetracks. So people ended up living in horse stables. Now, they cleaned out the stables the best they could with whitewash and all, but people who had to live there over the summer said the stench was unbearable. And of course, many people were getting sick. This kind of gives you an idea of how bare and empty the rooms are. We spent the summer of 1942 at this temporary location at the fairgrounds, and then we were told that the permanent camps are now ready for us. And so they took us on bus back to the Union Depot in Seattle and put us aboard trains. They did not tell us where they were sending us. All we were told is, once you get on the train, you have to pull the shades down, and there was an armed guard at the front and the back of every train car. It took us 2 days to where we were going. When we got there, after getting off the trains, they boarded us on these army trucks and drove us to our new home. We ended up in Minidoka, Idaho, in a very desert-like area where they had built this permanent camp, very much like an army camp, 44 blocks of tar-papered barracks. Again, no furniture, only the bed that you're going to sleep on, and only one light bulb in every room, and no running water or any other, accommodations like that. This is a picture of the camp that I was sent to, and here's the layout of all the blocks, as you can see. We ended up here in block 14. This time we were given 2 rooms to live in, but not connecting rooms. You had to go out the front door of one and into the front door of the other to get back and forth. because the buildings were unfinished, there were no ceilings on the rooms. And so the noise from one end of the barrack carried all the way over to the other end. We were fortunate that we didn't have any crying babies in our barrack, but there were others who had to, you know, try to withstand that. Notice that there is this canal that runs along the southern border of our camp, and this here shows you the typical layout of the camp, where the barracks on either side and the common buildings. This would be the mess hall, and then this would be the sanitary building, men on one side and women on the other. Also in this picture, you notice all these vegetables up here. That's because by the second year, because there were so many farmers in the Japanese population, they found a way to use the water from this canal to irrigate these fields, and they started growing all these vegetables to try to improve our diet. Besides that, they were allowed to raise chickens and pigs. So this is the picture of the block that I was in. This was taken in 1944, and by then quite a few of the people in camp had already gotten permission to leave, and I'll get into that in a little later as to how you were able to leave the camp. And this is me right here in this red circle. So because it was a very dry and desert-like, whenever it, and the few times it did rain, it was just a big muddy mess. The thing that I remember the most were the terrible dust storms. Because there was no vegetation to hold all the sand down, whenever there was any kind of wind, this dust would come blowing at you. And being in a dust storm is worse than being in a snowstorm, because it really hurts when that sand pelts you. And everything would be covered with sand. So we learned to carry a scarf with us to keep our nose and mouth covered. And then you'd go back to your barrack room, and your bed, your sheets, your clothes, everything would be covered with the sand. And it was just a big, terrible mess. Of course, we were under armed guards watching us from these watchtowers 24 hours a day. One of the things that the government really forgot to provide adequately was schools for the children. 17,000 of us were 10 years or younger, 10 years old or younger. And the government did all of this by saying it was a military necessity for the defense of the United States to put us in these camps. Now, it's important for you to know that in all of World War II, there was not a single person of Japanese ancestry in America or in the territory of Hawaii or Alaska that was ever found guilty of espionage or sabotage. Because there was no provisions for schools, the men in the camp got busy making furniture for the school-age children. And they designated one of the blocks on the west side and another one on the east side for elementary schools, and then they designated 2 blocks in the middle of the camp, one for the junior high schools and one for a high school. And so you can see in these pictures how crude the conditions were, but you know, people just made do with what they could. And in my case, I do remember sitting on these picnic-style benches, and then anytime you had to do written work, you'd sit on the floor and use that bench for your work. So I was in the camps for grades 1, 2, and 3. This is a picture of the high school students and how they use the camps. You know, they would use different buildings for some of the different courses, and this is them changing between classes. It was not uncommon for the teacher in the high school to be the only one with the textbook. And she then would read to the students out of the textbook, and it was your job to take notes. It was not uncommon for typing classes, for instance, to have only 2 typewriters in the classroom with a class of maybe 35, 40 students. And so then you got cardboard replicas of what a keyboard looked like. so that you could practice your typing on a piece of cardboard. And then every 10 minutes the teacher would ring the bell so that 2 new students could go up to the real typewriter and practice on that. And of course science classes without any science equipment and so forth. Classrooms without any maps, without any blackboards. I think all of us, when we finally got out of the camps, felt like we were at least a year behind in our education. This kind of gives you an idea of what a typical room looked like. Anything that you see here in the way of a shelf, that is something that the prisoner built for themselves. They scrounged for scrap lumber, and they would build things that would make their accommodations more livable. If your father was a carpenter, maybe you were lucky enough to get a table or a chair to sit in. But my father was a cook, so we didn't get any furniture. And we lived out of our suitcase for those 3.5 years. Of course, all of our meals had to be taken in the mess hall. I can tell that this picture was taken in Arkansas because there are too many trees in it. I didn't mention where the camps were. There were 10 permanent camps in all. 2 of them were in California. There was one called Tule Lake, and the other one was called Manzanar, and they were very close to the Nevada border. And then in Idaho, we had Minidoka. In Arizona, there were 2 camps, Gila River and Poston. Then in Utah, there was Topaz, and then in Colorado, there was Amachi, and in Wyoming, there was Heart Mountain, and then in Arkansas, there were 2 camps, Roar and Jerome. So that were the 10 camps. Now these were really concentration camps. I know people don't like me to use that word, but a concentration camp is an enclosed compound, a guarded compound, where ethnic, religious, or ethnic minorities are placed for political reasons. Now so President Roosevelt himself called them concentration camps. Lots of people refer to them as internment camps. But the internment camps were only really the camps run by the Department of Justice, like the ones I told you they took those essays to. And so an internment camp is only for immigrants. As I said before, 2/3 of us were American citizens. So we came under what was called the War Relocation Authority, which came under the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now, our meals in camp were based on a budget of 45 cents a day per person. And they came to this by the fact that that was the amount that they had allocated for those that were serving in the military. So in the beginning, before we got all of those vegetables growing on our own, it was mostly a lot of canned foods. Things like pork and beans, and Vienna sausages, maybe some canned stew, things like that. The thing that the people of my parents' generation worried about the most was that because we're eating cafeteria style, we tended to go and eat with our friends instead of eating with our family. And my parents felt like they were losing control of their children. The sanitary conditions were absolutely the worst. This is what the showers were like. You can see how close the spigots are to each other. Each block housed about 250 to 300 people. And so we're talking about, I don't know, maybe there were, 30 showers available at one time or something. But there's no partitions between the showers and no kind of privacy at all. The toilets were just all out in the open like this with no partitions again. Absolutely no concern for your own self-worth or dignity. Now, I'm only 6 years old, so, I don't care so much, but I had teenage sisters, and it was really troubling for them. And to the point where my sister, who was 14, 15, and 16 years old when she was in the camp, she was really severely affected. And when we got out of the camp and we moved to Minnesota, she actually ended up having a nervous breakdown. So, you know, it did affect people psychologically. As children, we really had very little to do outside of school, because if you're only allowed your suitcase to go off with, your parents are not going to let you pack a lot of toys. So the only thing I was allowed to bring was a deck of cards. And boy, did I learn how to play a lot of card games in camp. My brother Tom, you know that one that I told you went off to the movies? Well, my parents didn't know it, but he had refused to go to school when he was in camp. Now, maybe it was his way of protesting, I don't know. But every morning he'd go off like the rest of us, pretending he was going to school. He would go to another block and sit around and play cards all day. Until it was probably well into the 3rd year that we were there when a teacher came to our home and asked my parents why Tom was not in school. And that was the first they heard of it. And of course, they were very upset. Not only that, we were supposed to eat all of our meals in the mess hall, our own mess hall. But you know, if you've seen a lot of these cooking shows, you know how depending on everybody can get the same ingredients, but depending on how creative you are, you know, you can make your food taste a lot better. So Tom used to go from block to block to test out the food and find out which block had the best food. And that's where he would end up going. Because we had that canal on our southern border, people were allowed to swim in it over the summer and skate on it if you had skates, because the temperature in that camp ranged from 110 degrees in the summer to 20 below in the winter. Now I'm talking about living in a shack-like barrack with absolutely no insulation, only the boards it's built with and the studs, and a piece of tar paper on the outside. Now we did have pot-bellied stoves, but we were only allowed 1 bucket of coal per day. So the room was cold enough, if you had standing water anywhere, the water would freeze. So anyway, they did swim in the canal, and they tried to make life as normal as possible for the children. And so they did have like Christmas parties and Easter egg hunts. Now, the story about the Christmas party is that I heard that when we were going to the camp, one of the little boys was overheard asking his mom, "How is Santa ever going to find us?" And this story got into the newspapers, and so church groups from all over the Midwest and all over the East Coast sent in hundreds of presents to these camps. And at least that's what I was told. All I know is that I was there from age 6 to almost 10. I never got a present. Neither did anybody else in my family. So maybe it was just certain camps that were lucky enough to get those presents. To keep the teenagers occupied, they organized sports teams. Now the teenagers, the high school kids themselves, actually petitioned the government for the equipment so that they could have baseball, football, and basketball. And they organized teams, and they would play the teams from the surrounding little towns around us. And because those teams always had to come into our camp to play the game, our team was always at the top of the league. I think it was that home field advantage, you know, yes. So, now, as far as my mother, really, for the first time in her life, the only really housekeeping that she has to do is the laundry, which she had to do by hand, which, you know, was a big job because after all, there's 10 kids. And she had, but other than that, she didn't have to cook any meals. She had very little house cleaning to do. And so for the first time in her life, I would say probably since coming to America, she had time for hobbies. And people then who knew how to do a certain craft or art would volunteer to organize a class. And she took things like flower arranging, where they did it with crepe paper flowers, and pattern making, and also calligraphy. Now, the story of how I ended up in Minnesota. During the war, there were already Japanese Americans, we call them Nisei. Nisei means our generation. There were already Nisei serving in the military at the time of Pearl Harbor because the government had reinstated the draft in October of 1941. So I'm talking 2 months before Pearl Harbor happens. But now, after Pearl Harbor, they're in a quandary. What are we going to do? Here we have people of Japanese ancestry in our military. And so they left it up to the base commanders to decide what to do with them. In most cases, their rifles were taken away and they were given desk jobs or jobs in the kitchen, or they were actually given a discharge. And within time, they actually then reclassified all of those Nisei as 4C, which means enemy alien, where at one time there were 1A and eligible for the draft. So after Pearl Harbor, a lot of them had gone to their recruiting stations and tried to enlist in the military, but the military would not take them because they had been reclassified as 4C. Now, the only ones that were still in the military, there was a group of 60 Nisei who were in the secret program called the Military Intelligence Program. They were being trained at a language school at the Presidio in San Francisco. But when the executive order was signed, those people in that school had to be moved out of the West Coast, and so they were looking for a new place to relocate that school. And they asked many of the major cities in the Midwest and some out east if they were willing to take that school. And the first one to step up was Governor Stassen of Minnesota. And he said we would welcome that school in our state. And that's how the Military Intelligence Service Language School ended up first at Savage, which at that time was called Camp Savage. And then as it got too big for those facilities, it got moved to Fort Snelling. So my brother Joe, that is in this picture right here, the day after he graduated from high school, June of 1943, he volunteered to serve in the military. And any Nisei who volunteered to serve, the first thing they would do is give them a language test to see how good is your Japanese. And based on that, if it was good enough, you got placed in the Military Intelligence Service. And so that's where Joe gets sent. And he comes first to Camp Savage, and then he's in that group where during the year they get moved to Fort Snelling. So he is doing his training here in Minnesota, and during the time that he is in training here, he helps my brother Fred and my sister Amy and my brother Tom get released from the camp. How does he do that? Well, you had to be able to prove that you had a home to live in, and a job to go to, or a school that had accepted you. And so Joe helped my brother Fred get enrolled at the Dunwoody Institute. And there my brother Fred learned a trade. He learned the dry cleaning business and became quite a successful small business owner. He owned the Red Robin's Cleaner in Highland Village in St. Paul. And then my sister Amy, he got her a job as doing secretarial work at Fort Snelling. And so he was able to send for her. And then my brother Tom, because he was not going to school in the camp, Joe found a family that lived near Lake Calhoun that was willing to take him in as sort of a houseboy where he could do some light housework for them, and he could finish his education at West High School. And so that's where he ended up getting his high school diploma. I think he was almost 20 years old by the time he graduated from high school. But then he went on to Augsburg College and majored in math and became a math teacher for the Minneapolis Public Schools, where he taught at Roosevelt High School for almost 30 years. So, you know, he did turn out okay. So besides the fact that people like my brother volunteered to serve in the military, and it was in 1943, at the beginning of that year, that the military finally decided they were going to accept Niseis as volunteers in the military. And the only branch that would accept them was the Army. They were not allowed to serve in the Navy or the Marines or the Coast Guard or any of those other branches. But in 1944, they decided they were going to draft them again. So if you can picture this, the government has put you and your family in a prison camp, and now they're asking you to volunteer to serve in the military. Actually, surprisingly enough, out of the camps, they were hoping to get about 3,000 volunteers. They got about 1,500. From Hawaii, they got over 10,000 volunteers. Now, why the difference? Because people in Hawaii weren't put in these prison camps. They were allowed to live their lives, you know, as normal, although they were under martial law. But that made the big difference. So we used to have this honor roll outside the entrance to our camp that showed the names of all the people that were serving in the military from our camp. And if the girl's arm was out of the way, you would see my brother Joe's name on that list. Now, of course, then the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brings the war to an end. And so we know then that the camps are going to close. In August of 1945, then, we're faced with the decision, where are we going to go? My father did not want to go back to Seattle because of all of the racial discrimination that we had faced there. Besides, there was nothing left for us to go back to in Seattle. You know, if you're in a prison for over 3 years and you can't pay your mortgage and you can't pay your property taxes, your property gets foreclosed on. And so then my brother Joe said, you know, I think Minnesota seems like a very welcoming place. I think this is where the family should move. So it was my brother Fred then who found a house for us to live in, and that's how we end up moving to Minnesota. Those who lived on the West Coast, they ran up against signs like this, that they were not welcome back in the former towns or states that they used to live in. So this is the home then that we end up living in. It's in South Minneapolis on 40th Avenue South and 52nd Street. And I just remember when we got here, it was on August 18th in the middle of the summer, and we had to take the train from Minidoka, Idaho through Omaha, Nebraska, transfer there, and then take the train up here to Minnesota. But when I got out of the train and we got into cabs to go to our new home, I couldn't get over how green the city was. You know, when you live in a desert for over 3 years and you see all this greenery, I mean, I thought, my goodness, this whole city looks like a park. And then the house that we lived on, it was on one of those streets where we had these huge elm trees, and the elm trees, you know, would arch above, so it was like driving through an arbor of trees. I mean, it was just absolutely beautiful. So this is then where I end up finishing my elementary education, going on through junior high and high school in Minneapolis, and then to the University of Minnesota, where I ended up getting my degree in education and ended up teaching for the Minneapolis Public Schools. Now, if you're interested in this story, these are 3 other books that I would recommend besides the one that you're reading, which is historical fiction. But the infamy, the shocking story of the Japanese-American internment in World War II, that is a nonfiction book. Very well written, very readable, because he actually finds testimony from people, you know, who lived through this experience. So he has all these anecdotal stories. Richard Reeves is the author of that book. The middle book, Personal Justice Denied, Report of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Citizens. This is the report that was published after a bipartisan commission in Congress was formed in 1980 to investigate why so many violations of the Constitution were allowed to take place. And in that report, they stated it was due to not military necessity, but because of a long history of racial discrimination, wartime hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. So this then, it's a very scholarly book, but what they did was this commission traveled to 10 cities that had large Japanese-American populations. They took testimony from over 700 people, and this is where it's all documented in this book. And then this last book, When the Emperor Was Divine, by Julie Otsuka. This is a book that's often used in high schools. In her book, she doesn't use any proper names. She just says mother or father or the girl or the boy, because what she's trying to tell you that, you know, for the most part, all of our experiences were the same. If you were a Japanese-American mother during this time, you had the same experience as every other Japanese-American mother. Or if you were a girl like me growing up during that time, you had that same kind of experience. So these are 3 books that I would highly recommend. I'm not sure if your library has any of them, but you can check later. And then if you're in elementary school, I would recommend these books. This one is called Journey to Topaz, or The Journey Home, both written by Yoshiko Uchida, and she experienced this life in the camps. Her family was sent to Topaz in Utah, and so this is based on her personal recollections, and again, I would say very suitable for maybe like 3rd grade on up. Once you're out of that picture book stage where you can read chapter books. Another good book for high school students is A Farewell to Manzanar, which is often used in high schools. I should have put that one on the screen as well. It's by Jean Wakatsuka Houston, and that was made into a TV docudrama. So anyway, you can see then how my experience, if you've read this book, kind of parallels a lot of what the main character Keiko went through in that book. Towards the end of that book, when we meet up with Keiko again, her name is now Kay. And you know, that kind of brought a smile to my face, because my real name is Shigeo. But when I got out of the camp, I became Sally. Now why? Because, you know, there was an author that once said, if you get put in prison for shoplifting, well, when you get out of prison, what do? Well, you stop shoplifting. But what if you get put in prison because you're Japanese? What do you do when you get out? Well, to us, you know, the answer was try to be as American as possible, to the point where we didn't want to learn the language, we didn't want to observe any of the culture, we just wanted to fit in. And so I think my experience is very much like those of others my age who came through this experience. Now I do want to leave time for questions, so if you have something you would like to ask, okay.
Because you also had so many children in the camp and everything like that, what did you do about clothes? Because children would, you know, outgrow the clothes you brought.
Right, so her question is, what did you do about clothing? Because over those years, the children would be growing. Of course, in my case, I was lucky enough, I had older sisters, and I wore hand-me-downs all those years. But the government did provide $3 per person for clothing allowance every month. And so then we used to pool the money. We could order out of the Sears or Montgomery Ward catalogs, and whoever needed something the worst would get to order an item. Now, we really didn't have the proper clothing to be in that kind of climate, because we came from Seattle. You know, we don't experience 20 below in Seattle. So that was one thing that was hard for us. I mean, we put on all the sweaters and, you know, coats we had to keep warm in the winter. But that's mainly how we managed what to do about clothing. Okay? Yes. Who was it that was the minister? Your father? Oh, okay. She said her father was a minister. And every month they had this event called pounding, which means you were to bring a pound of something to the church, a pound of some kind of food or even clothing. And they lived close to Manzanar, so they would bring that then to Manzanar.
Once a month.
Once a month. That is wonderful. I applaud people like your father. In our case, the minister from that Japanese Baptist church in Seattle, he lost, really his congregation. And so he moved his family to Twin Falls, Idaho, which was the closest town to our camp. So because he decided he needed to be near his people. And this is a Caucasian man I'm talking about, Pastor Emery Andrews. Not only that, but because he had a church bus, people would say to him, "Oh, Pastor Andrew, I stored my dining room table, my card table and chairs at your church, in your church basement. Can you bring that to me?" And he'd drive back to Seattle, pick up those things from his church, and then drive it back to somebody in the camp. He did that weekend after weekend. And I'm talking about one way being, I think, close to 800 miles. So, there were people that were very generous and kind and really supported us. I'm sorry to say there weren't enough of them, because even the ACLU would not help out with our cases, because the person who was the head of the ACLU at that time was a close friend of President Roosevelt. So he told his lawyers not to get involved. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
When you moved into Minneapolis, you run into discrimination there also?
Okay, when we moved to Minneapolis, did I face any discrimination? Well, I did get the normal name calling. I was the only Japanese person in the school, in my classroom. My brother was 2 years younger than me, so he was also in the same school I was in. But we were the only Japanese family for several miles around. And then it wasn't long before we got anonymous letters. "We don't want any Japs in the neighborhood. Get out or else." But, it could have just been one person doing that, because who knows, but they did come quite regularly at the beginning, and we just tried to ignore it. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yes?
So do you know Go for Broke?
Do I know who?
Go for Broke.
Yes, Go for Broke is the slogan of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, because when they finally asked for Niseis to volunteer and then later drafted them, they were placed in a segregated military unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And their slogan was "Go for Broke," meaning, give it your all. And they became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its time of service, for its size and length of service. Just as an example, one of the battles that they were involved in was the Battle of the Lost Battalion. This happened in the Vosges Mountains that bordered France and Germany, and there was a group from Texas, the Texas Rangers, that were trapped between two enemy lines in that area. 2 other units had been sent up there to rescue them and failed, but the 442nd were sent in, and they had terrible fighting over 4 days, and they finally were able to rescue these Texans, but in doing so, they suffered 800 casualties to save 211 Texans. So that's what I'm talking about. It was almost as if they were used in these situations because they felt like they were expendable. Maybe the American public wouldn't have such a big outcry if it was these Japanese faces that were dying instead of Caucasian faces. That's just my opinion.
They are honored in the World War II Museum in New Orleans.
Yes, I understand that New Orleans has a World War II museum, and they are honored there. That's right.
The Go for Broke Education Center contacted me last year, and I had no idea what it was.
Oh.
So in the next couple of years, we're going to see traveling exhibits from Go for Broke.
Yes, in fact, we're involved in that.
Oh
The Twin Cities chapter of the Japanese-American Citizens League, we're putting together how Minnesotans helped Japanese resettle here in Minnesota as part of this story.
Well, mine was totally different because they contacted me because I'm the alumni president of my School of Nursing in Rochester.
Oh, yes, that was the other place. Yes,
So
exactly.
you're the different
Yes,
part, but
because,
they were accepted as many Japanese-American nurses were accepted.
right.
One of the only school in the country that would allow that.
That's exactly right. In fact, one of my dear friends, Kimihara, was a graduate of your School of Nursing, and I know that's part of the story that we're telling, is how the Mayo Clinic and St. Mary's, St. Mary's Hospital in right, in Northfield, Rochester, excuse me, Rochester, helped get some of these women out of the camps. So that was another way people could get out. Another thing is that, there were many college-age students in the camps. They had to leave their colleges if they were in a college on the West Coast and be in these prison camps. And so through the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker group, they found schools in the Midwest and out east that were willing to take in these students, offer them scholarships, help them maybe find a place to live outside of the dormitory or part-time jobs if they needed it. And about 4,000 college-age students were able to leave the camps due to that. And in Minnesota, the first school to step up was Macalester College. And then it was Hamline University, Carleton College, St. Olaf, St. Thomas. They were the ones. It was all these private schools. The University of Minnesota said they couldn't take any because they had government contracts for the war effort. So, yes, yes.
How were you treated by the guards in the concentration camps?
How were we treated by the guards? For the most part, if you were doing what you were supposed to, you were left alone. They did not intermingle and become friends or anything like that. They were there to do their job, and so we basically had no problems with it. The scariest thing for me was at night. It'd be pitch dark, and of course, you have no bathroom in your room. If you had to go to the bathroom, you had to go out to the sanitation building, which was like half a block away. And then so I would, make my mom go with me. We'd take our flashlights. As soon as the guards saw movement, they beamed their searchlights on you and follow you wherever you went until you got back in your room. So that was kind of scary. But there were riots in 2 of the camps. And in some cases, people were shot and killed. So, yes. Okay? Yes? Do I feel Jamie Ford accurately depicted what was happening? Yes, I thought he did a very good job in telling the story. The only thing I had a little problem with was when Henry goes to visit Keiko in the camp, and they sit around in her room drinking tea. Now I'm wondering how that happens when you have no place to boil your water and nothing to drink the tea out of, So in a way, he made the room situation sound a little more normal than it really was. Okay, any other questions? Yes?
What kinds of things did your parents tell you or your minister tell you to help keep your spirits up?
What did our parents tell us to keep our spirits up? Well, they have a couple of phrases in Japanese, okay? One is shikata ga nai. Shikata ga nai means it can't be helped. It's beyond us. We have no control over this. So in other words, just go put up with it and do your best, shikata ga nai. And then the other expression is about don't do anything to bring shame to our family. They're very big on that we should always act in such a way that we didn't embarrass our own family. So, in other words, behave yourself. We know this is a terrible situation. We're trying to do the best we can. Just put up with it the best you can and behave yourself under all situations. I know my brother, I keep talking about Tom, but he's the one with all these anecdotal stories. I think this was before we got into the camps, when we were still in school in Seattle. He was one of these kids who was always acting up in the classroom. I kind of have a feeling maybe he was ADHD, although maybe undiagnosed, you know. And so he said that one time the teacher got so angry with him that she called him a Jap. And everybody, you know, did that double take because she knew she had stepped over the line. And then she started to cry. So, yeah. So anyway, those are things that happened, yes.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the governance structure of the camp, if it was something that was organized by the people or if it was...
Okay. He's asking about the governing structure of the camp. Okay. The way the camps were governed was, of course, the administration were all government employees, and they were all Caucasian. They came from the Department of the Interior. And then what they did was they set up a camp council. And what the camp council was that every residential block was to elect one person to represent your block that would then be part of this council. And it was through your representative that you were supposed to bring any grievances or requests that then would go to the administration. So that's the way it was structured. Now, because all of these things had to be held in English, that meant people of my parents' generation who really were, you know, more experienced and maybe more knowledgeable even, were left out of the loop. And people of my generation, they were mostly 20 years and younger. And so I think that for people like my father and other Isseis, they really felt that they lost their role as a father and as a leader because now the government was telling them what to do and how to run their families. And for him, I would say that this whole experience was the most devastating because by the time we moved back to Minnesota, he was 63 years old. Now, imagine yourself at the age of 63 losing everything you've worked for all your life, and now you have to start all over again. And because we had lived in a segregated neighborhood in Seattle and lived in a camp full of Japanese people, my parents never had to master the English language. And so now we come to Minnesota where they're forced to be, you know, do everything in English. And they're that, you know, proverbial fish out of water. My father got a job in the kitchen of the Curtis Hotel, which no longer exists, but used to be one of the big downtown hotels. But really, after a year, he gave it up because he said the English was just too much for him. So he spent the rest of his working life as a janitor for St. Mary's Hospital on Riverside Avenue in Minneapolis. So I would say that he lived in probably a state of clinical depression for the rest of his life, and he lived until he was 88. Yeah. Yes?
As you mentioned, this is a lot of parallels going on now with what you went through back then. I'd be curious to hear what your message would be to, not to pick on anybody here, but anybody holding public office. What would be your message to them regarding health?
Okay, what is my message to people in public office? Is that what you're asking? Wow, I should have such power. Yes. Well, I would say to them, be careful of what you're doing. Be sure that you're following the Constitution. Be sure you're aware of people's civil rights. Do not repeat a mistake that happened in the past. You hear a lot of public servants referencing what happened to us as if that's kind of a precursor for what can happen now to Muslim or Arab Americans. I say that's a big mistake. And as far as the rest of us, I really think we have to be ready to speak up. You know, there's a lot of organizing going on now, but you know, when you see injustice, you really have to be willing to speak up about it and not just be a bystander. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
What did your other siblings, did they end up staying in Minnesota? Did they end up moving to any other states?
Okay, of the 10 siblings, the first one first we all came out here because we had a home to live in. My oldest sister, Marion, she ended up getting married in camp, and she had her first child in camp. If you can imagine having a brand new baby, taking it back to that shack with no refrigerator, no running water or anything. We all came out here in August of 1945, but within a year, her husband said, the winter is too severe. So they moved back to Seattle, and she is still living there to this day. She's 96 years old. Yes. Okay. Then the others of us, a lot of us went through the Minneapolis Public Schools and on to the University of Minnesota. But then gradually, there were only four or five of us that remained in the state due to, once you got out of school, the job that you got would send you wherever. And so people scattered all over. Of the 10, there are 4 of us still living. My youngest brother, myself, my sister who's 2 years older than I am, and then my very oldest sister, the one in Seattle. Mm-hmm. Yes? Okay, being only 6 years old, what did I understand about, about what was going on? Well, I would say certainly I did not understand the enormity of what was happening. I knew that we were moved out of our house. I knew that we were living in a terrible place. But in a way, I felt safe because our whole family was together. That isn't true of every family. A lot of them lived separately for certain reasons. So those things, and after a while, things kind of just become normal. But it isn't, or it wasn't until I became old enough to really understand what we went through and how unjust it was that, it started to get to me. But I think my older siblings felt that way from the time they were put in the camp. I mean, my brother Tom that refused to go to school, he said, look, I have had my civics classes. We've studied the Constitution. I know that what they're doing is wrong, so, but I wasn't at that point in my life yet. Okay, over there?
Did you ever feel any anger towards the U.S. or your captors?
I'm sorry, you have to talk louder for me.
Did you ever feel any anger?
Okay, do I feel any anger towards the United States? I have to say that I really don't, personally. I don't feel anger. I think you maybe are all aware that after that commission that was formed, to study what happened and why everything went wrong, it resulted in something called the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, signed by President Ronald Reagan, and that then allowed for the President of the United States to write a letter of apology to each one of us that was still living and a redress check for $20,000. Now, it isn't every government that's going to admit that they did something wrong, right? So you have to give the United States credit for that. But, you do have to make sure that we've got the right leadership in place, people that are making wise decisions. I think we are probably almost down to the wire, so I'll let Mary take over. You are welcome. Thank you so much for having me.